V97. You are sitting right next to someone you love. The room is warm, the screen is glowing, and neither of you has said a single word in 45 minutes. Not one. You are not fighting. You are not tired. You are just gone. Two bodies in the same room, two minds somewhere else entirely. St. Teresa of Avila called it the most dangerous kind of silence, not the silence of peace, but the silence of two people who stopped reaching for each other and convinced themselves that being in the same room was enough. She was not talking about television, obviously. She died in 1582, 443 years before the first flat screen ever hit a living room wall. But what she described, the slow interior distance that grows between two people who share a roof but stop sharing a soul, she mapped it with terrifying precision. And what modern relationship science has confirmed in labs across 3 continents since 1997 is that Teresa was not being poetic. She was being clinical. The silence you sit in on that couch is not neutral. It is doing something to you. It is doing something to your marriage. It is reshaping the architecture of how your brain relates to the person beside you, one quiet evening at a time, in ways that accumulate invisibly and announce themselves only when it is almost too late. And the data on what exactly it is doing will make you want to put your phone down right now. This channel covers the documented history of the human heart. Love, loss, what we owe each other, and what we throw away without realizing it. If stories like this one matter to you, subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it is the best way to make sure this kind of content keeps getting made. And drop a comment below telling us what city you're watching from. We read every single one. This script draws from 2 primary sources that go far beyond the usual self-help surface. John Gottman and Nan Silver's landmark longitudinal study published in 1999 through the University of Washington's Family Research Lab, where Gottman tracked 650 couples over 14 years inside a real residential research apartment. Couples lived there for weekends while cameras and biometric sensors recorded everything. And from the collected interior castle correspondence of Teresa of Avila, specifically the critical edition translated by Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez, published by the Institute of Carmelite Studies in 1979, a translation that preserves Teresa's original Spanish precision in ways the popular editions quietly sand down. These are not popular psychology sources. These are the receipts. Now back to the story. Teresa of Avila was born on March 28, 1515, in the walled city of Avila, Spain, a city so cold in winter that the stones of its cathedral still crack from frost 4 centuries later. She was the daughter of Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda, a cloth merchant of Converso lineage, and Beatriz de Ahumada, who died when Teresa was 13 years old. That death mattered. Teresa would write about it 70 years later, still raw. She understood, early and personally, what it felt like when someone who was supposed to be present simply was not there anymore. Not dead, just absent. Just gone behind a wall you could not see but could feel the whole shape of. She entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Avila in 1535 at the age of 20. And for 20 years, she did what thousands of people do in their marriages every single night. She went through the motions. She prayed because she was supposed to pray. She followed the routine. She kept the schedule. She was present by all external measurements, and she felt, as she wrote in her autobiography with characteristic bluntness, like someone walking in a thick fog, moving but not arriving. 20 years. That is a long time to be physically present and spiritually absent. She knew the feeling from the inside. She had cataloged its textures, its particular brand of numbness, the way it made everything technically fine and secretly hollow. The breakthrough came in 1554, when Teresa was 39 years old. She knelt before a statue of the wounded Christ, the ex homo, in the corridor of the convent, and something cracked open in her. She described it as suddenly understanding the difference between being near someone and actually being with them. The distinction wrecked her. She wrote in her life, "I had been with God the way a bad guest stays in a house, eating the food, using the fire, but never once looking the host in the eyes." That sentence. Stop there for a second. A bad guest, eating the food, using the fire, never looking the host in the eyes. She was describing cohabitation without communion. She was describing every couple who has sat through 3 episodes of something without saying a meaningful word to each other. She was describing the slow, painless, invisible dying of a relationship that still looks fine from the outside, still passes every external inspection, still answers, "We're good," when someone asks how things are going. And here is where the modern science slams into Teresa's mysticism with the force of a freight train. John Gottman, emeritus professor at the University of Washington, spent 14 years watching couples interact in his research apartment, a converted space on the university campus that couples lived in for a weekend while cameras recorded everything, while sensors measured heart rate and skin conductance and facial microexpressions cataloged at 30 frames per second. 650 couples total, tracked from 1986 through 1999. He measured something he called bids for connection, the small, often invisible moments when one partner reaches toward the other. A comment about something on TV, a touch on the shoulder, a question that does not need to be asked but is asked anyway because asking it is really just a way of saying, I am still here. Are you still there? Gottman found that in couples who stayed together and reported being happy, partners responded to those bids 87% of the time. 87. They turned toward each other instead of away or nowhere. In couples who divorced within 6 years of the study, that number dropped to 33%. 1 in 3 bids met, 2 out of 3 dissolving into the air, unacknowledged, vanishing. And the person who made the bid noticed. They always noticed. They just stopped logging it consciously after a while. It went underground instead, into the body, into the nervous system, into the slow calcification of hope that Gottman documented in couple after couple who told him, in their exit interviews after divorce, that they had not seen it coming, that everything had seemed fine. Now think about the couch. Think about the television. Think about what a screen does to bids for connection. It intercepts them. It gives both people something to look at that is not each other. It provides the illusion of a shared experience. You're both watching the same thing, you are technically together, while quietly eliminating the need to actually connect. You can sit together for 2 hours, laugh at the same moment, gasp at the same twist, feel the same spike of emotion at the same scene, and never once look at each other directly, never once make a bid, never once respond to one. You shared an experience the way 2 strangers share a bus. You were both there. That is all. Teresa had a name for this phenomenon. She called it interior withdrawal, in the 5th mansion of the interior castle. Her masterwork, written in 1577 in the convent of St. Joseph in Toledo, written in under 2 weeks while she was suffering from what historians believe was a combination of malaria and tinnitus, she described the soul that has retreated so far into its own interior that even love cannot find the door. She was writing about the relationship between the soul and God, but she drew from the most human experience she knew, the experience of watching 2 people share a space and nothing else, 2 people whose proximity had become a kind of unspoken agreement. We will not demand the hard thing from each other. We will not require the full exposure of being truly known. When the soul stops seeking, she wrote, it does not rest, it hardens. And what was once a wall between 2 people becomes, over time, a room of its own. A room of its own. Neuroscience in 2012 named it differently. Researchers at the University of Michigan, in a study published in the journal Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience, identified what they called neural synchrony, the measurable alignment of brain activity between 2 people who are genuinely emotionally engaged with each other. When couples interact with real attention, eye contact, physical touch, responsive conversation, their brainwaves begin to match, literally. The brainwaves of 2 people in genuine connection start to mirror each other, particularly in the theta frequency range associated with emotional processing and memory formation. The brains are, in a real and documented sense, talking to each other, not metaphorically, electrophysiologically, 2 nervous systems reaching across the gap. When they are both looking at a screen instead of each other, that synchrony disappears. The brains stop talking to each other. They are in the same room. They are miles apart. And neither nervous system knows how to report that to its owner in a way that feels urgent, because from the outside, everything still looks fine. You are still together, you are still home, you are still watching the same show. Teresa would not have had the vocabulary for theta waves, but she wrote about the same thing from the inside. She described the moment in prayer when real connection happens as feeling like 2 flames becoming one without either one being consumed. And she described the counterfeit, the performance of presence without its substance, as 2 candles standing side by side, each burning alone, each throwing the other's shadow. 2 candles burning alone, each throwing the other's shadow. That is your Tuesday night if you are not careful. That is your Saturday. That is the decade you spent in the same bed and wondered, when things got hard, why you felt like strangers, not understanding that you had been becoming strangers, one comfortable evening at a time, invisibly, in a process so gradual and so disguised as normalcy that there was never a single moment to point to and say, that was it, that was when it started. It started everywhere at once and nowhere in particular. It started the way fog forms, not by arriving, but by thickening. Now here is where it gets precise, because this is not just poetry, and it is not just philosophy. There is a specific, measurable, documented mechanism by which nightly television silence damages a relationship, and it was first described not by a neurologist or a marriage therapist, but by a sociologist named Robert Putnam in his 2000 book, Bowling Alone. Putnam analyzed data from the Roper Social and Political Trends database, 26 years of surveys from 1974 to 2000, and found that every additional hour of television watched per day correlated with a 10% reduction in civic engagement, social trust, and this is the part people skip. Intimate conversation within households. 10% per hour, not per week, per day, per additional hour. a couple watching 3 hours of television a night, 7 nights a week, over the course of a year, has statistically displaced the equivalent of hundreds of hours of genuine conversation. Not dramatic conversation, not therapy-level conversation, just the ordinary, slightly boring, occasionally beautiful conversation of two people who are paying attention to each other. The conversation that tells you what someone is actually thinking right now, not what they thought last week when you had time to really talk. The conversation that keeps a relationship current. The conversation that is, by Gottman's measure, the only reliable delivery mechanism for bids. And here is the killer detail Putnam buried on page 231 of that book, in a footnote that almost no reviewer cited. The effect was not uniform. Couples who watched television together with the explicit intention of having something to discuss afterward, couples who watched as a prelude to connection rather than a substitute for it, showed no significant decline in intimate conversation rates. The television was not the problem. The intention was the problem. Or rather, the absence of intention was the problem. The screen left to its own logic will always become a replacement for what it was supposed to accompany. Teresa said something almost identical in a letter she wrote in 1576 to her brother Lorenzo de Cepeda, who had just returned to Spain from the Americas after living in Quito for 28 years. She was giving him advice on prayer, on how to return to intimacy with God after decades of practical distance. And she wrote, "It is not the years apart that damage the soul. It is the failure on returning to actually return. It is the failure on returning to actually return. You can come home every night for 30 years and never actually return. You can sit down next to someone every night for 30 years and never actually arrive. The body is present. The will is somewhere else. And the will, Teresa insisted throughout the interior castle, is everything. Without it, presence is just proximity. Proximity is a logistical fact. Presence is a daily act of the will. They look identical from across the room. They feel completely different from inside." Gottman's research confirmed this from an entirely different direction. In 1992, he published a study in the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology where he identified what he called the 4 horsemen of relationship apocalypse: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Contempt was the most lethal. The eye roll, the dismissive sigh, the communication that says, "I have judged you and found you beneath engagement." But here is what the popular summaries always leave out. Stonewalling. The 4th horseman does not begin with a slammed door or a refusal to speak. It begins with a drift. It begins with two people who gradually stop initiating, who stop bidding, who find it easier to look at something else, a screen, a phone, a ceiling, than to risk the small exposure of reaching toward another person and maybe not being met. Stonewalling does not announce itself. It shows up dressed as comfort. It looks like a cozy evening at home. It feels like rest. And it does its work in the space between episodes, in the silence between one thing and the next, in the moment when you could turn toward each other and instead both reach for your phones, cold, quiet, slow. By the time a couple recognizes it, Gottman found the average pair had been living inside stonewalling for 6 years without labeling it. 6 years of evenings that felt fine. 6 years of distance that accumulated the way dust does, invisibly, evenly, until one day you notice the whole surface is gray and you cannot remember the last time someone cleaned it, and you're not sure whose turn it was. Teresa entered that same fog in 1535 and did not find the door out until 1554, 19 years. She was not a stupid woman. She was one of the most intellectually formidable figures of the 16th century, the first woman ever declared a doctor of the Church by Pope Paul VI in 1970, 488 years after her birth. And she spent 19 years not noticing that she had stopped genuinely seeking connection. 19 years performing the external forms of intimacy without inhabiting them. 19 years of swept courtyards and unexplored interiors, of showing up and calling that the same thing as arriving. If Teresa of Avila could lose 19 years to comfortable distance, you can lose a decade on a couch without realizing it. Here's what the research says the body is actually experiencing during that silence. A 2016 study from Brigham Young University, led by Dr. Julianne Holt Lundstad and published in Perspectives on Psychological Science, tracked 340,000 participants across 148 independent studies and found that social isolation, defined not just as being alone, but as lacking genuine connection even while physically present with others, increased mortality risk by 26%. Not discomfort, not unhappiness, mortality, the risk of dying sooner. The body registers the absence of real connection as a threat, even when the mind has convinced itself that everything is fine. Cortisol stays elevated. The immune system underperforms. The cardiovascular system carries the extra load. Inflammation markers rise across the system. The body keeps score in ways the mind refuses to acknowledge until the doctor looks up from the chart with an expression that does not match the numbers. Your nervous system does not know the difference between being alone in an empty house and being alone on a couch next to someone who has stopped really seeing you. It registers both the same way. As danger. Low-grade, chronic, invisible danger. The kind that never trips an alarm but never stops accumulating either. The kind that adds itself to every day quietly, the way interest compounds, unnoticed until you look at the total. Teresa wrote about something she called the Erode, a spiritual term for the experience of going through all the motions of love, the rituals, the proximity, the shared meals, the obligatory affection, while feeling nothing alive inside the connection. She was careful to say the Erode was not a sign that love had ended. It was a sign that love had become mechanical, automatic, safe. And safety, she insisted, was love's most seductive enemy, because it asked nothing of you. It required no vulnerability, no risk, no exposure, just the repetition of forms that once carried meaning and had somewhere along the way become empty of it without bothering to announce the change. The soul in aridity, she wrote, is not suffering. That is the problem. Suffering would at least require it to feel. If you value content like this, real, documented, unflinching, subscribe to this channel. It is the best way to support us directly. And leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. This script is built from primary sources, and your engagement is what makes this kind of research possible. Now, back to the story. What Teresa prescribed for the aridity, the spiritual withdrawal, the comfortable distance, was not a grand romantic gesture, not a vacation or a dramatic reconciliation or a difficult conversation that clears the air in a single night. It was something she called determined determination. She used that specific phrase in that slightly redundant way, in the way of perfection, written around 1566 in the convent of St. Joseph in Avila, in a small room off the main cloister. She meant the small, daily, unremarkable choice to turn towards someone instead of away, to make the bid, to answer the bid, to refuse the comfort of distance when it presents itself as rest, to refuse the permission of the quiet evening when the quiet evening is really just avoidance, wearing comfortable clothes. She described it in physical terms. Do not let the soul grow cold in the evening hours. This is when the enemy of love does his quietest work, not in the great temptations, not in the dramatic failures, but in the small permissions. The permission to sit without speaking, the permission to look without seeing, the permission to share a space and call it enough. These were her words, written 460 years ago. They read like a description of a modern couple after dinner, phones in hand, television on, each one drifting separately into a screen while their life together narrows around them unobserved. Gottman measured exactly how those small permissions compound over time. In a 2002 paper published in Family Process, he and his colleague Robert Levinson analyzed the daily interaction patterns of 79 couples and found that the ratio of positive to negative interactions in a stable relationship needed to be at least 5-to-1. 5 moments of warmth, engagement, humor, curiosity, or tenderness for every 1 moment of criticism, irritation, or withdrawal. 5-to-1. That ratio, maintained over time, predicted relationship stability with an accuracy that made other social scientists skeptical until they replicated it. But here's the part of that ratio that never makes the inspirational posts, never gets quoted in the engagement bait articles about marriage. A neutral interaction, 2 people sitting in the same room looking at a screen, neither warmth nor friction, just coexistence, does not count on the positive side of the ledger. It counts as nothing. It is a void. And in Gottman's model, a void is not neutral. A void is a missed bid. A missed bid is a small withdrawal from the emotional bank account. And small withdrawals, made daily for years, eventually empty an account that looked full from the outside until the day it simply was not. Teresa described this same dynamic in a letter to Father Geronimo Gracian in 1578, using the relationship between a spiritual director and a soul under their care. But the mechanics are identical to marriage. She wrote, "It is not the great neglects that undo a bond. It is the quiet assumption that the bond will sustain itself without feeding. A river that is not fed by rain does not announce its drying. It simply becomes shallow. And then one day you step in where you expected depth and find only dust. A river that becomes shallow without announcing it, and then dust. And the person standing in it, confused, looking at their feet, trying to remember when the water went." Now let us talk about what actually happens in the brain during the specific experience of sitting silently next to someone you love while watching something on a screen. Because this is not theoretical. This is not philosophical. It has been measured with electrodes and fMRI machines and the kind of granular physiological detail that makes abstract warnings feel like things you can hold in your hands. In 2014, researchers at Princeton University, led by neuroscientist Yuri Hassan, published findings in the journal Neuron showing that meaningful communication between 2 people produces what he called neural coupling. The listener's brain activity actually mirrors and slightly anticipates the speaker's brain activity. The more genuine understanding occurs between 2 people, the tighter the coupling. Hassan called it the most direct transmission of information possible between two brains. It is the neuroscience of being truly heard. It is what your body is doing when someone really gets you, when you say something and you can feel it land. But the coupling only occurs during active, engaged communication. During passive shared media consumption, two people watching the same content, there is no coupling between the viewers. Their brains respond to the screen independently. They might as well be in different rooms. They are having identical experiences without having a shared one. It is the neurological equivalent of two people reading the same book on opposite sides of the planet. Same words, no connection. Different rooms, same couch, same blanket, no bridge. And here is the piece of this that takes it from sad to structurally damaging, from unfortunate to quietly catastrophic. The absence of neural coupling is not just a missed opportunity. It is a pattern that the brain begins to expect. A 2019 study from the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences found that repeated periods of social non-engagement, even in the presence of others, begin to recalibrate the brain's default assumptions about connection. The brain learns, slowly, that this person beside me is not a source of engagement. It begins generating less preparation for real conversation. It starts to treat the other person the way it treats a lamp or a houseplant. Present, real, familiar, and not requiring attention. Not from hostility, from adaptation. The brain is adaptive. It learns the environment it lives in. If the environment is two people on a couch not connecting, the brain adjusts. It stops expecting to connect. And eventually it stops noticing the absence. Teresa called this the closing of the interior doors. She described it in the interior castle as the soul that has become so accustomed to remaining in the outer rooms of the castle, the comfortable, accessible rooms, the rooms that require nothing, cost nothing, risk nothing, that it forgets the interior exists. It is not that the soul has lost the capacity for depth. It is that the soul has stopped believing depth is available. It has forgotten what the further rooms even feel like. It has settled into the courtyard and called the courtyard home. There are people, she wrote, who have lived in a castle for 40 years and never gone beyond the first courtyard. They know every stone of that courtyard. They keep it swept. They are not unhappy, but they have never seen what is inside. They have never gone beyond the first courtyard. They have never asked what else is there. They have accepted the courtyard as the whole of it and found it sufficient, which is a very different thing from finding it good. That is the couch. That is the screen. That is the comfortable first courtyard of a relationship. The place where everything is fine, where nothing is demanded, where the surface is swept clean and the interior is unexplored and the years go by and go by and go by until one of you is sick, or one of you loses a parent, or one of you gets a diagnosis, and suddenly you need the interior rooms. You need the depth you never built. And you reach for each other and find that the bridge was never finished, and you're not sure whose fault that is. And the answer is, it was no one's fault. It was just the accumulated weight of enough evenings that felt fine. Gottman's data from the 14-year longitudinal study showed something that should stop you cold. Couples who eventually divorced did not spend their final years fighting. In the majority of cases, documented in the 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work, published in 1999, the couples in the most danger were not the ones who argued constantly. Conflict, Gottman found, is not automatically lethal to a relationship. What is lethal is the end of conflict. The moment when a partner stops protesting, stops complaining, stops fighting for being heard, and simply goes quiet. Not peace, resignation. The bids stopped. The evenings were quiet. The surface was smooth. They reported, in exit interviews conducted after the divorce was final, that things had seemed fine for years before the end. Fine. Not good, not close, not alive. Fine. The word people use when they have stopped hoping for better and are managing the distance as efficiently as they can without naming what they are managing. And here's what makes Teresa's framework so much more demanding than Gottman's. Because Gottman gives you the data, and Teresa gives you the diagnosis. Gottman says, the bids dropped. Teresa says, you chose to let them drop. Gottman identifies the pattern. Teresa names the permission underneath the pattern. You permitted the evenings to be quiet. You permitted the screen to carry the silence. You permitted the distance to feel like rest, because rest was easier than the alternative, and you told yourself you would do the alternative tomorrow. And tomorrow, until tomorrow became a year, and a year became 5, and 5 became a life that looked complete from the street. Teresa of Avila was also brutally specific about what the return costs. Not emotionally. She knew the emotional return was worth it, but practically, in terms of the daily effort required. In the way of perfection, she wrote about something she called the prayer of recollection, which was her term for the act of deliberately drawing your attention away from distraction and toward the person in front of you. She said it required what she described as the slow and gentle but utterly firm return of the wandering gaze. Not a violent correction, not a dramatic moment of crisis that forces attention, a slow and gentle but utterly firm return. Every time the gaze wandered, and she said it would wander constantly, because that is the nature of a mind that has learned to wander, you returned it, without drama, without self-flagellation, without the performance of effort, you returned it. That is the practice, the slow and gentle but utterly firm return. Every evening, however tired, however many episodes are queued up, the return of the gaze to the person you chose, toward the bid you almost missed, toward the conversation that starts nowhere special and goes somewhere necessary. Teresa of Avila died on October 4th, 1582, in the town of Alba de Tormes, approximately 20 kilometers east of Salamanca. She was 67 years old. Her last recorded words, according to the testimony of Sister Anne of St. Bartholomew, who held her head as she died, were, "My Lord, it is time to move on. Well then, may your will be done. O my Lord and my spouse, the hour that I have longed for has come. It is time to meet each other. It is time to meet each other." She said it at the end of her life, as though meeting, real meeting, full presence, the complete turning of one soul toward another, was still the goal, still the thing, still what everything had been building toward. She had spent 67 years learning how to really be present, 19 of them in comfortable distance, the rest of them fighting her way back through the courtyard and into the interior rooms of the castle, one day at a time, one slow and gentle but utterly firm return at a time. And she died still convinced that the meeting, the real meeting, was ahead of her. Still possible. Still worth everything. Here is the late reveal that reframes all of it. In 2007, a team of researchers at the University of Rochester, led by Dr. Harry Rice, published a paper in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, introducing what they called the responsiveness model of intimacy. They had spent 11 years across multiple studies involving thousands of couples in 14 countries, trying to isolate the single variable that best predicted whether a relationship would deepen or die. Not compatibility, not shared values, not physical attraction, not even communication frequency, not how often you talked, but whether what you said actually landed. The variable was responsiveness, the lived experience of feeling understood, validated, and genuinely cared for in a specific moment of sharing. One variable, above all others. And then they ran one final analysis that did not make the abstract, buried in the supplementary materials, cited by almost no reviewer. They found that responsiveness could not be transmitted through a screen. It could be performed through a screen. It could be mimicked. You could say all the right things through a text message and have your partner feel heard for a moment and then feel alone again in a way they could not quite explain. But the full neurological and physiological markers of genuine felt responsiveness, the oxytocin release, the autonomic nervous system calming, the measurable cortisol reduction, only occurred consistently during in-person, face-to-face interaction where both parties were attending to each other rather than to a shared external stimulus, not side by side, toward each other. That distinction was everything. You can text someone you love every hour. You can watch the same show every night for 10 years and know every character and quote the same lines and feel like that is a kind of intimacy. And it is something, but it is not the same thing. It does not produce the same neurological outcome. Your nervous system will still be waiting, patiently, persistently, at a cost you feel as vague dissatisfaction and unexplained loneliness, and the sense that something is slightly wrong that you cannot name. For the moment when someone turns away from the screen and toward you, when they ask a question they do not strictly need the answer to, but are asking because they want to know what is actually happening inside you right now, and you feel, in the way you feel things before you think them, that you have been found. That is the moment Gottman's bids are reaching for. That is the moment Teresa was describing in the language of mysticism. That is the moment the University of Rochester spent 11 years trying to measure, and it happens on a couch in a living room between two tired people who could just as easily watch one more episode instead. Teresa swept the same courtyard for 19 years. She knew every stone. She was efficient. She kept it clean. And then, one afternoon in 1554, something cracked open and she walked past it, through the first door, and did not stop. The couch is still there. So is the person next to you. The question is not what you're watching. The question is whether sometime in the next hour you will put down the remote and turn toward them, not with anything prepared, not with anything dramatic, just with the slow and gentle but utterly firm return of a gaze that has been somewhere else long enough, daily, however brief. That was the University of Rochester's final footnote. One quiet sentence added almost as an afterthought at the end of 11 years of work. The minimum effective dose of genuine responsiveness necessary to maintain felt intimacy in a long-term relationship appears to be daily, however brief. Not grand, not scheduled, not the conversation you have been putting off for 6 months. Daily, however brief, the bid, the answer. The moment when you choose the interior rooms over the comfortable courtyard you have memorized. Teresa called it determined determination. Gottman called it turning toward. Neuroscience calls it neural coupling. Your nervous system calls it the one thing it has been waiting for since the last time someone really looked at you. The screen will still be there tomorrow,